everyone. Welcome to this amazing panel, Curating Windows and Mirrors for the School and Classroom Library. I want to start by having our awesome panelists introduce themselves. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Sarah Marie Jette. I am a fourth grade teacher in Massachusetts. I've taught fourth and fifth grade for this will be my 13th year coming up. I'm also an author of a middle grade book. It's called What the Wind Can Tell You, and it's an own voices story about a girl and her older brother who has a significant form of epilepsy, and her really developing her voice over the course of the story.
Thank you. Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Stringfellow. I teach 5th and 6th grade English in an independent school in Boston. I've been teaching for over 25 years, and I'm really passionate about helping students develop their reading lives. I'm also a middle grade author, and my debut middle grade book will be coming out in 2022. And it's a fantasy based on my Caribbean background with a Black mermaid who is really important in the story, and it's also own voices.
Excellent, thank you. Jess?
Hi, I'm Jess Lifshitz. I teach 5th grade ELA in a public school in the suburbs of Chicago. And I have been teaching for this fall will be my 17th year. 15 of those years in 5th grade. And sort of my whole goal with my students is to help them see reading and writing as a way to learn about the world and then use what they learn in order to create positive change. So I'm excited to be here to talk about how we can use books to help do that.
Yes. Julia?
Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Torres, and I teach in far northeast Denver Public Schools. I am a language arts teacher and librarian. This is the summer after my 16th year, and then next year I'll start my 17th year as an educator. Most of my work is centered around supporting students in the development of reading identities, but then also learning to independently seek challenge when they are reading. So I don't want to always be the person who's telling them, okay, this is the next book that's going to challenge you. I like it when they can say, this was a challenge for me or not, and then they understand what it means to progress as readers independently. So that's work that I've been trying to experiment with, but then also just get a lot of feedback from them with regard to, what makes a book challenging and what makes a reader challenged, because it's so personalized and different for everyone. So I'm really passionate about that right now.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for being here today. We wanted to start, since the title is Curating Windows and Mirrors, with where this term came from and give credit to Rudine Sims Bishop. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see one of the opening quotes from her article that came out in 1990. It says, "Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world created and recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books." Julia, did you want to talk a little bit about what this piece means and Rudine Sims Bishop means?
Sure, yeah. I think that we've become pretty familiar with that term, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And a lot of folks use that terminology in conference proposals sometimes. Folks will use it just in casual speech. Folks will reference it when they're presenting. I know that I do frequently. And given the fact that that language and Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's work has really advanced children's literature, but then also studies about children's literature, and then also education, it's so important to give credit where credit is due. So I think it's a common practice in education to kind of like beg, borrow, or steal, right? We go online and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we take from other folks, but that becomes problematic when the people whose intellectual property is being taken are people of color or marginalized, erased voices, specifically Black women. So in this case, it's really important in all cases to remember that those words belong to her first. So it's so important. I know all of us are on the same page with this, but we want any viewers or listeners to just make sure that they understand the importance of citing not only Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, but any elders who have informed our thinking and our work, anybody really. It's so important to practice citing, because citing is political, and we all know this. We've heard that before. Citations are political is a quote in and of itself, but I'm forgetting exactly who said it first. So help me if somebody knows. But I know that that's something that Angela Davis has said. And I just think it's really important to remember the folks who get credit in most academic spaces are not the marginalized or people from marginalized populations. So that's why we wanted to just take a few moments to give credit to Dr. Bishop for her work, to thank her, and to recognize that she's still alive, she's still around, and she's still thinking and inspiring us all. And so it's important to, as important as it is to feel passionate about this work and to speak, it is also important to listen and to give credit. Cite a sister.
Thanks, Julia. So this is setting context for what we're going to be talking about in our conversation today, but we also wanted to pull up the graphic from Diversity in Children's Books from 2018. 2019, the statistics have come out, but they don't have the graphic yet. So we wanted to just talk about this a little bit to give even more context as to where our conversation is going today. Lisa, do you want to talk about this?
I would like to. So the graphic is one that's really easy to find. It's one that was published first in 2015 by the librarians at the University of Madison School of Education, the Cooperative Children's Book Center, Dr. Sarah Park Baylin, working with illustrator David Hugh. And they made an illustration based on the statistics that were published for 2015, and then again, most recently in 2018, taking all of the books published in the United States for children and breaking those down by the demographics. And what the numbers showed is that even with all of the talk about the importance of diversity in children's books, the numbers are still pretty small. So only 1% of books published for children featured characters of American Indian or First Nations background. Only 5% featured characters that were Latinx in background. 7% were Asian Pacific Islander or Asian Pacific American. 10% were African or African American. And then the shift comes with 27% of books written for children featured characters that were animals or other. So others would be crayons or trucks or buildings or other inanimate objects. And then 50% of the characters were white characters. And so I think the thing that's interesting is that when you look at the combined, even just that animal other category of 27%, that number is more than all of the characters of color, the groups combined. And so when we talk about representation for people of BIPOC background, it's still pretty small, and it's really hard for kids to find those, as we talked about the metaphor of windows and mirrors, to find representation for themselves. Some recent numbers have come out, and there's not an infographic yet for those, but the numbers don't change. They have added some new categories. So going forward, they're going to start to track numbers for Pacific Islanders separately. There's a lot of books that are starting to feature brown skin characters that don't have like a specific, category attached. So they're going to look at that. Disability representation, and then also LGBTQ IAPT plus. representation. And then I think for next year, they're going to look at Middle Eastern representation specifically. So tracking those numbers is going to be really important. But again, the numbers, when you look at all together, white children plus the category of like animal other still is 71% of all representation in books for children. So that's why it's so important for us to talk about these numbers and helping to curate books in the libraries that we put in our classrooms and in schools so that kids can find representation in the books that we share with them.
And I think from the 2015 to the 2018, the percentage of white children's books with white characters fell from like 70-something% to the 50s, but that where it increased was in the animals and other. Like it didn't trickle down. They just wrote more animal books.
Yeah. I share with my students those numbers, and it's funny that my sixth graders, we looked at the infographic at 2015 and 2018, and we saw that shift from white characters to animal and other, which kind of grew. And it was like, why do we think illustrators and authors chose to go that direction? And it was an interesting discussion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's also
and publishing houses chose to keep buying those books. Sorry, go ahead.
Add that it's interesting to also look at those compared with the Lee and Low statistics that come out that focus on the authors of the books, and looking at, even as we saw this increase perhaps in characters, Black characters was really I think where the increase we saw the most was. We didn't see that same increase in the number of published authors of color.
Right.
And so just sort of, and kids get that. Kids really, it's amazing to talk about these numbers, even with fifth graders, they can see that as problematic. So looking at the statistics of representation of characters compared to we don't see that same sort of drastic increase in the number of authors of color who are being published.
Right. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's really interesting about the 2018 graphic, when people are able to look at it, is that they added the actual metaphor in the imagery of the mirrors. And you'll see that the BIPOC characters are holding mirrors that kind of represent the size of the representation that they have in the industry. And the mirrors all have damage to them, and they have cracks and chips to them. And it kind of goes along with, there's a passage in Dr. Sims's article that reads, when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they're devalued in the society of which they're a part. And I think that part is so important, going to what Jess just said about authors of color, and thinking about that representation from own voices or authentic voices, or voices from inside of the communities of color writing about themselves and their own experiences. That a lot of times when you have somebody writing about an experience that's outside of their own, they don't always get it right. And sometimes the representation isn't entirely accurate, and there's harm that sometimes is done. Mm-hmm. And so a student who's reading a book about their own identity, but there's misrepresentation, sometimes does more harm than good, than seeing themselves in a book that doesn't represent them accurately. So that's something that, as we're thinking about classroom libraries and how we find books that can, show our students, a side of themselves that they might not always get to see, how we do that in a way that's, accurate and honest for them.
I think it's really important too to think about the fact that the publishing industry is made up predominantly of white editors, of white people working in the publishing houses. So the folks who are making these decisions have to educate themselves as well on how to see gaps. I won't name an author or a title, but I will say that I have seen a book fairly recently written by a white author that included a character of color, a person who was a protagonist, who was a person of color. And so a lot of what the publishing industry I've seen do is they'll take their white authors that have a proven track record of making money by selling books of a certain nature. Then they'll put a protagonist that's a person of color on the cover, And you won't really find out that it's a white author and it's not an own voices text until you open it up and look at the back and see the author bio. So that's an important piece that folks need to kind of train themselves to look for and train our students to look for as well. I read the book, at least the beginning of it, and the voice was horrid. And it was supposed to be a mixed race protagonist who was Black presenting. And I just felt like, you know, it's really important for us to talk about not only the component of race and identity, but when we're teaching students about authenticity and own voices, you don't know what you don't know. So like, you won't know that there's a difference between Puerto Rican Spanish and Spanish from Mexico if you've never heard people speaking those different types of Spanish. So if you have a white author who just uses textbook Spanish in there and has a Puerto Rican protagonist, a lot of folks won't be looking for that authenticity with the language piece because they don't know. So I think that we've got to teach our students about the importance of seeking out what you don't know, present them with resources, which I know Jess does a lot of this work, helping them to hone their inner critic, helping them to have that critical consciousness piece so that they're like racially aware. But then also we know that race is a social construct. So how has society constructed race in order to align it with power and representation? Because that's all part of the conversation as well.
Mm-hmm.
The people who are depicted more are they're going to see themselves in all of these roles, and they're going to feel consciously or subconsciously like they're in a position of more power. More visibility equals more power, especially in our classrooms. So one of the things that I've done is work with the Ladies of Disrupt Text, which is a collective that I am a part of, co-founder with Trisha Abarbia, Lorena Herman, and Dr. Kim Parker. And the work that we have done is try to get folks to really be critical in thinking about the books that we have in the classroom and in libraries, and then also our own personal bias, and then also supporting that work of, you know, the authors of color community is still, as they say, a very small portion of the overall bookshelf. So supporting own voices is one way that we can do that. Intentionally looking for Black LGBTQ authored texts, because those are the least represented. That's some work that we can do. And then supporting our students in the development of a critical consciousness as well. That's work that we can do. So I just wanted to drop that in there so that there is an antidote to all of this lack of representation, but it does take work on our behalf. And it's more than just looking at a cover, seeing that it has a Black or brown child or someone with hijab on the cover, and then choosing that book. You've got to go deeper than that. And I think that it's something that I'm continually working on as well, because as Lisa mentioned, Indigenous representation in most of our libraries is severely lacking, but it's also lacking overall in what's available to us. And then once you find what's available, you have to do the further work of checking to make sure that it's own voices and that it's legitimate, and not trusting that work to someone else who's going to build a book list for you, or someone else who's going to have your auto order for your shopping cart and tidal wave if you're a librarian.
With us, it's scripted curriculum, and they just buy the set that comes with the curriculum. And I had a discussion with the literacy coach. The books were 20 years old or just not currently relevant. So this year I'm going to be using with both ways and taking like short stories. I'm the one teacher of color in my school. I've been there. There's been 2 other teachers of color who've lasted 1 year. Our social workers are women of color, but of classroom teachers, I'm the only one. And I'm the one that speaks out, and they listen because I think they know better. So absolutely.
I think one thing that teachers can do also is, especially for those of us maybe who've been teaching a while, is to do some auditing of the books that you already have in your library. Because I know that one thing, as I've learned and grown as a teacher, is to be reflective. And, there are things that I did earlier in my career and, that I've reflected on and made changes about. And so the books that I purchased kind of, speaking to, what Sarah has just said and to what Julie just said, looking at like what I currently had and thinking about, the book was just the brown character, and then digging in and finding out like, oh gosh, that is a white author and I never really knew that, or that's a book that, has some harmful representation. I think there's some great, for teachers who are willing to start that work and who maybe have never done it, there's some great tools out there. Lee and Low has a classroom library questionnaire that you can download from their website. Tricia Barvia also has written a great article about inclusive classroom libraries. It has a questionnaire that you can go through and think about, like, you know, whose voices are represented, you know, who has power, who doesn't, and asking yourself these questions about the authors and the texts, and, you know, what kind of books, you know, are being centered in your classroom, you know, which books are on the library shelf and which books are in the curriculum. And all of those things are really important as you're being reflective.
And I just want to build on something Sarah had mentioned, that I think, I would imagine there's a lot of white educators watching, and I think this is a space we as white educators really need to step into. It's interesting because as a out lesbian teacher, I know that I'm often the one speaking up for representation of queer characters. And when I carry that weight, it is heavier than when a straight teacher could say the same thing. So I flip that. As a white teacher, I have a responsibility to speak up, because the truth is all children are being harmed by misrepresentation and a lack of representation. Because in that graphic, when you go and look at it, the one that Lisa was talking about, you see the white child surrounded by all these mirrors, really adding to this inaccurate sense of understanding their own place in the world as well. Mm-hmm. So this harms all of our students and of all races. And I think as white teachers, we have a responsibility to start speaking up and pushing back and disrupting text like Julia had talked about, because it cannot just be on teachers of color to make that argument. And I feel like that's a space that we can sort of work ourselves into and speak up more often than I know I have in the past, and that my white coworkers have in the past as well.
Mm-hmm. So you were making me think, you've answered like a bunch of the questions I was going to ask you, which is amazing, and I knew was going to happen. But I also want to just acknowledge that as a white cis woman, I have always seen myself in texts, right? As a child, all the way through, I have always seen myself in almost any book that I wanted to choose. And that in and of itself is such a privilege. And I think that the majority of educators are white women, and we need to acknowledge that just because life has always been comfortable in terms of choosing things to read, and we've always felt like we can see ourselves, that doesn't mean that, you know, most people can't, and that's a privilege we need to extend to all of our students, you know, in every community that they belong to. So I just think that, and it's hard work, but it's work that has to be done. I mean, I don't feel like it's a choice. We have to do it. So one of the things that I feel like I get the most pushback on as a coach is teachers who are fearful of bringing in like LGBTQIA plus issues or issues with race or religion, or, you know, I teach in a predominantly wealthy white community, and teachers are really afraid of parents saying, you're being political, or I don't want my child reading about this. So I'm just wondering, like, what advice do you have for teachers when, you know, they're worried about pushback from the parents, the board, you know, about these issues that there shouldn't be any pushback on, gender, et cetera, but there is. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. And then also in that same vein, like, are there any resources that you recommend that parents read or look at in order to inform themselves so that they can better speak with their kids?
I was just thinking about how it's our job to educate the child. Like, the parents are there, and the parents are important, but my role is my classroom and my children. And if we look at the way the youth are doing so much good in our country right now, they are leading, they are the leaders. So even as one thing I love about being a teacher is it keeps me fresh with what's happening, and the way my students inspire me with their outlook on life. They haven't learned all of the structured, oppressive parts of our culture yet. They are exposed to it, but our job as educators is to teach them. And if we teach them to ignore things that make you uncomfortable, then they are going to learn it at home and at school, perhaps. And it's not, I mean, the parents are important, and I form very close relationships with my students' parents, but my students are the most important thing for me. Right now, there's a lot of really good lists on anti-racist books. I think most independent bookstores have lists and shopping carts. I mean, if a parent wants to get educated right now, there's a lot of lists that they can look at.
I would say that the same, to echo what Sarah's saying, that, people, the books that we share with our students reflect real people and real lives, and that we shouldn't, protect or hide those real people and real lives. That a lot of things that you hear challenges about, our students are living those lives. They have family members and loved ones that, identify in these ways, and that also, they may be questioning themselves, or they may be living through experiences themselves. And so those things are affirming to them to have the books in their hands where they can see them. I mean, again, it goes back to what we're talking about today, to have a book where they see themselves, they see their families, they see their loved ones reflected back to them. So I think that that's the answer to parents, that, you're teaching students, or you're just providing them opportunities to read about real people that exist in our world and in their classroom, and perhaps in their lives themselves. And I would say, as far as resources, like in particular for like LGBTQIA books, there are plenty of like organizations that have like book lists. One I found was there's a group called welcomingschools.org that has a diverse children's book list in support of LGBTQ inclusive elementary schools, that had a great book list.
I just
some
finished
books.
This. And oh my God, it was just so incredible. I read Hurricane Child, and I loved that, but this one just left me speechless. And I was thinking
Case and Calendar.
Oh my goodness, they're an amazing writer, and the structure of the story and the friendships and the whole family, everything. But this is one it's going in my library, or it'll be I don't know what next year will look like, so we'll have to adapt.
Yeah, I know.
But I think about for the child who reads this and can find themselves in it, and it deals with the LGBTQ, but also with the race. It deals with so much, so eloquently. So sorry to butt in, Lisa, but I wanted to.
No, that's great.
Yep. I had my stack right next to me in case I needed to.
I just wanted to sort of jump in on a really practical level, because that's where I operate with 10-year-olds. I think one of the things we can do is know our why ahead of time. So I always think back, my first years of teaching, I taught first grade, which was a terrible idea. But I remember sort of one of the constant battles was over invented spelling, right? Because the parents, when we grew up, my generation, we had spelling lists, and that's what we knew, and it was weekly tests. The research now shows invented spelling does better for children and their writing, and we knew that as educators. We spent time in professional development learning about invented spelling. We understood why it was better. So parents, without fail, every year I had parents very angry that in my first grade classroom we practiced invented spelling. I wasn't afraid of those parents because I knew why we were doing it. I had practice being developed on how to explain that. My understanding was developed. We had conversations as staff members. So when parents came to conferences, and mostly it was with questions and concerns, because parents love their kids and want the best and are confused on why you're doing is the best for your child, I was ready. I knew how to explain what I was doing. I knew my why, and I was able to articulate it. I think when we're talking about, and it's not that parents are going to come in and have a problem with me reading a book with Black characters. They're going to have a problem with me reading a book that discusses white privilege and the role of white people in, maintaining white supremacy. I teach in a mostly white school district, fairly affluent. And so there's a lot of fear about, well, you're making my child feel guilty. If I don't understand the why, if I don't understand my own reasoning, those parents become a roadblock, right? But if I have professional development that helps me understand why it's important that we read about systems of oppression and why I teach my students about their role in it, and if I have practiced having those conversations with my coworkers, the conversation looks really different. I don't then go to a defensive place. I don't go to a place where I don't know what to say. I know my why, and I have practice articulating it. So I think that that's something we can do as teachers to really continue to have these conversations and know that this is an important skill that we're teaching in order to build empathy, in order to build a sense of identity, in order to build better citizens who are more capable of interacting with people who are not just like them out in the world. And then we can say those things to parents. And then the other piece of it is to wrap all of that in the standards that we're required to teach. So when I had a dad come in and question why we were reading a book about a Syrian refugee family and why I was making the classroom political. Now, my first instinct is to say, if your politics don't believe in empathy, something's wrong with you, but I didn't do that. That was problematic. What I went to is one of my responsibilities is to teach students to understand the text that they're reading and the characters they're reading about. And because my students have the privilege of seeing themselves in many of the books they read, they're really good at reading and understanding books where the characters are very much like them. What they're lacking skills in, because they live in a community where everyone looks very much like them and lives a similar life, they're lacking skills in how to read a text where the person is very different than they are, where their lives are different, where they need skills like, how do I understand the context of a person's life and the history that impacted it? And I need to teach them those skills. I can't do that if I'm using books only that recreate the life that they're living. So in order to teach them the skills they need to understand text, I need to pull in books that have characters whose lives are different so that we can practice those skills together. When I present it that way, it's not that all of a sudden he walked out thinking that I was doing the right thing, but it's hard to argue with that because it's all wrapped into the standards. So I think those are some practical things we can do as teachers to sort of prepare for those conversations we know are going to happen.
I'll just jump in and add that a lot of times we center these conversations around what it is to work in white suburbia or a predominantly white space, because there's definitely a different, I have worked in a predominantly white school where the teaching population and student population were predominantly white, but I now am in a community that is predominantly people of color. And at one time we had majority teachers who were people of color. That's no longer the case, but my student population is 98% Black and Latinx. So what does that mean? My work I see as being about the process of discovery. We're now entering into a phase where soon, I think it's 2022, there are going to be, I read this on National Geographic, there are going to be more people who identify as mixed race or biracial or multi-ethnic than not, which I think is awesome. Yes, I have that same mug. Sorry, I don't want to, but I have the exact same one. That I will show you a picture of it later.
What are the chances?
What are the chances? That's awesome. So back to what we were saying, you know, like these commonalities, people who are gonna have things in common and then people who are gonna have things totally separate. In my community, for a long time, there was tension in between the Mexican and Salvadoran population because there is political and socioeconomic tension in those countries. Instability predominantly caused by a lot of the economic stuff that the US has put on them. So it's my job as an educator to be aware of cultural differences, but then also to support unity among people of color, because one thing that white supremacy does not want is for people of color to come together. So we build these hierarchies and we build these lines and divisions about who's more white adjacent, who's Spanish is better, who's, multi-generational family is more legit. There's all these conversations that we have. And my work is to try to break down some of those barriers and also try to help the students understand. And Goldie Muhammad talks about this in her book, Cultivating Genius, that their excellence is already—
I have that too. It's right on I have that book too.
Yeah. It's
my
amazing.
summer book.
It's amazing. Yeah, Cultivating Genius is solid. Everybody should have that if they don't have it already. Yes.
It's right there on the floor.
We got to understand that the
We can have a whole.
There's in my room, but yeah, we don't want people to always think that excellence. My students have been trained to believe that excellence is what comes out of white suburbia, and they need to strive to be like that in order to be excellent. And that's very damaging to their self-esteem, to their ability in their own like personal power, to their ability to believe in their own personal power. My thoughts are racing faster than my speech, but I think that it's so important for us who are working in predominantly POC communities to remember that cultivating that genius within every child is going to require a breaking down of some of those ingrained beliefs that excellence is external to what they are. They're fine, but not excellent because they speak predominantly Spanish. Which is like the most ironic thing, right? That we live in a country where the school system tells kids it's good to be bilingual. Yes, you should definitely learn this. But how many adults do you know who use their high school language that they took that was obligatory? They had to take a second language, and then they don't, a lot of them, develop it after high school. They just took the grade to pass. And the classes we know in language in high school are not the best. No offense to anyone listening who is a middle school, foreign language teacher. But it's just, I think, so important to remind our students of color. It's important to see yourself reflected, but then also you should be, and I say this a lot and I'll say it again here, you should believe that you can be a creator of content. You don't need to think that there's something magical or extraordinary about these authors of color that they got published, but you could never do that. You need to understand that the excellence is within you. And so a lot of my work is building up that self-esteem and helping them to believe in themselves and to see the excellence within them. Yeah, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but there you have it.
When I think of that also as teachers of writing, what we're doing when we're bringing in more voices is we're providing more mentor texts of what writing can sound like, that it's not all 5-paragraph essays, that you kids, you have the power to tell your stories in whatever way that works for you. And so when we bring in graphic novels and novels written in verse and novels that aren't, using the same sentence structure that's been around for, in published literature, we're saying to kids, there's a variety of ways. Not only are there a variety of stories to be told, but there's a variety of ways to tell them. And I think for myself, I've done a fairly terrible job in the past of, when I pull books for mentor texts, that it's been a very similar type of writing. I mean, I think we talk about sort of the canon in middle school, but I think there's one in elementary school in terms of, how many times have we pulled out Patricia Polacco? And not that there's anything wrong with her writing, but if that's all we're showing kids, we're teaching them there is one way to write a story. And I think when we're more aware, then we bring in, not just as readers, what we're giving them, but as writers, we're bringing in more mentor texts as well for them.
Absolutely.
I'll just quickly add that goes back to our bilingual texts that we bring in, or our, as Jess was mentioning, like Liz Acevedo is one who writes in English and Spanish. And so it's really awesome for my kids to be able to see that they can do that. And before Liz, lots of other writers have done it. Gloria Anzaldúa was an essayist. So opening up genre for them as well, letting them know poetry works, essays can be a good thing. Just the 5-paragraph essay is a little overdone and dry at this point. We've ridden that horse to exhaustion. But it's, the essay originally was supposed to be about trying things out. Because I learned in my writing class that essay comes from the French word essayer, which means to try something, which I didn't really realize. And I hope I pronounced that correctly. But yeah, so the essay is meant to be a place where you can try out ideas and explore them. So reimagining that with our students is really empowering work as well.
2 years ago, I explicitly gave my kids permission to use their native language in their writing. It's something they could do, but I didn't make it you can go ahead. And it was the best was at parent conferences when the parents were reading their writing and could see the native language embedded in this way or that way, and just the smiles on their faces. So it's allowing kids to just make it the norm to have exposure to all these different books, to try it out yourself. Take that mentor text, be inspired, and make it your own fan fiction.
And I think that's such a wonderful trend that's in publishing now, where authors of color are pushing back on the italicizing of
Yes.
like native languages. And so like the whole, like people can read it, and you can, just like we're expected to get things in context, in reading a book, in a fantasy or some other type of book, you can get things in context if it's in a different language that is not your home language. And white students can do that too.
Yeah, I loved Matt Mendez's Barely Missing Everything. He really flips a lot between Spanish and English, and it was so seamless. It's a beautiful book. So Lisa and Sarah Marie, I'm wondering, as authors, so stepping outside the teacher role into the author role, what considerations do you make when you're thinking about characters in terms of who's going to be reading your books, your audience, who you hope will read your stories? So how do you think about developing your characters?
I think for me, I mean, this book that's coming out in 2022 with HarperCollins is my debut, and I have one other manuscript that'll be coming out in 2023. Is just writing for the kid that I was when I was 12, and I didn't see a lot of books that reflected me as a Black girl, and so that's why when I was teaching, and Marley Diaz's started her campaign in 2015 for 1,000 Black girl books. It was so awesome to see a sixth grade girl say, I don't see myself in books, and I'm gonna start, collecting these books. So for me, I'm contributing to that, writing books with Black girls, because I didn't see that growing up as well. And then I think for also just to be a book, that has relatable characters that all kids could root for. So, a kid that's smart but flawed, a kid that's brave but scared, a kid that makes mistakes but will try, and so but also that a Black kid can identify with. So the book that I wish I would have had.
Me too. I grew up in Lewiston, Maine, Mexican American, and Maine. Not too many of us. Like the only other time I saw Mexicans was the migrant workers passing through my supermarket where I bagged groceries, So and when there were books with Latinx characters, they were either in cities, and Maine isn't known for its cities, or in like the Southwest. So like I never really saw a character like me. So my book, it's the setting isn't explicitly Maine, but they visit a lighthouse and they go to a county fair. My parents used to race harness racing horses. So there's like elements of my childhood in there. I also think that middle grade kids, they don't have a lot of control over their lives, right? Like they have siblings that might be hard to be with, or their parents and their life, and they might have to go to their siblings' sports games after school, or they don't have a lot of choice, but they are starting to see the world around them. And it's that where they want to make change, and they're developing their voice. And that's something that my main character has to go through, her kind of speaking out for her brother, but also for herself. And I was also, this book is inspired by a boy I nannied for 2 years who has a significant form of epilepsy, refractory epilepsy. I don't have epilepsy. So when I was writing the story, it was after when he became a big brother. The day that I was returning from meeting his big brother, I was driving home and I pulled the car over because the idea just came to me. But so it was tying in my Mexican, and he is part Mexican as well. And I was very conscious when I was writing, because this family means so much to me, that it was authentic and carefully told, which is probably why it took a very long time to write. But it's also deals with, like I have students whose siblings don't go to my school, and in my classroom library are there books that have siblings with significant impairments who aren't, like Julian in my book, he's nonverbal, and there's lots of children who have different impairments that are not represented in Kidlit. So I was also writing for who I was, and I was inspired by this baby who is growing up to have this incredible big brother, and the relationship. And their moms have told me that the book is it's very true. Like Isabel's character is very much like the boy that I nanny for's younger sibling, and how they interact with each other. And so that, yeah.
Great, thank you. So we're actually right at time, and I just want to thank all of you so much for coming together and your brilliant ideas and all of the work that you're doing for teachers and your students and communities. And this was really amazing. I have so much to think about now. So thank you all so much. Anyone have any last final words or final book recommendations?
If people are looking for books, I know that teachers might be looking for more resources. I know that the We Are Kidlit Collective 2020 reading list has a lot of great suggestions. That's a great list of books to people look at. That's really inclusive.
This is Renee Watson's new one. It's so sweet. It's just, and it's also
Black Joy.
Black Joy, exactly. They don't have to be dealing with massive. It's just lovely, and there's going to be more, right? I think it's going to be a series. There's going to be more. It's so sweet. Love it.
I just finished last night Linda Sue Park's Prairie Lotus.
Love this too. It's so great.
It's sort of her answer, in my opinion, to when everyone says, well, now that I know, now I can't remember, what's the series that's so problematic?
Little House on the Prairie.
That we know that that's a very problematic series. What do I use instead? Use this book. It is beautifully written. It's an engaging story. I'm actually thinking about making it my first read aloud for 5th grade this year. It was beautiful.
And it's hard to find historical fiction with people of color written by authors of color. We have a historical fiction unit, and the books that are provided, they might have center around a character of color, but they're not own voices. I also loved Pam Eunice Ryan's Manana Land. It has to do with people leaving a country because of bad things. It deals with complex issues in a very kid-appropriate way.
And I'll just recommend I Am Every Good Thing. It's a picture book, but I think picture books are totally relevant for all grade levels.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book, and the illustrations are phenomenal. And I think that it does the work of changing the narrative about Black boys and what it means for them and for others who are around them. And we know that police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement is getting a lot of attention, but these issues have always been present for folks like us, the melanated people of this world. So it's important, I think, to check out I Am Every Good Thing. I have the copy over there, but I'm not going to get up.
Great.
I wrote it down.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.